When the lawyer read my aunt's will, my name wasn't supposed to be there. That single line shattered the calm of that dim, wood-paneled office. The scent of old paper and lemon polish hung in the air, and the ticking of the grandfather clock behind me sounded louder than usual, like each second was counting down to something I didn't understand. My father sat stiffly beside me, arms crossed, his jaw locked tight. Across from us, my aunt's son, my cousin Daniel, looked as if someone had just kicked the floor out from under him. He kept glancing at me, eyes wide, mouth slightly open. I wanted to look anywhere but at him. It had been 10 years since I'd last seen Aunt Margaret. 10 years since the screaming match that split our family clean in half, my father on one side, his sister on the other, me somewhere in the crossfire. And now, here I was, sitting in her lawyer's office, listening to her voice echo from the grave through a letter I never expected to hear. To my niece, Claire, the lawyer read slowly, who once saw me not as a monster, but as a woman trying to make peace. I leave the farmhouse and everything within it. Silence. The kind that feels like the air itself went missing. I could feel every pair of eyes in that room turn toward me. My father's face went pale, Daniel's went red. I didn't understand. I hadn't spoken to her in years. Why would she leave me the farmhouse, the very house she'd sworn never to let my father set foot in again? Daniel slammed his palm against the table. "This is a joke, right?" he said, his voice shaking. "She wouldn't do that. She wouldn't cut me out." The lawyer adjusted his glasses. "I assure you, Mr. Wells, this is the final, legally filed will. Your mother signed it 3 months before her passing." 3 months. That was around the time she'd tried calling me. I'd ignored it. I thought it was another attempt to stir up old wounds. My chest tightened with guilt I didn't yet know how to name. "There must be a mistake," my father murmured, rubbing his temples. "Margaret was vindictive, yes, but she wouldn't drag Claire into this mess." The lawyer cleared his throat. "Mrs. Wells's instructions were explicit. The farmhouse is now legally Miss Claire Turner's property." The pen in my hand rolled off the table and clattered to the floor. I didn't move to pick it up. Because deep down, I felt it, that faint, familiar chill that comes right before your life begins to change. Before it all began. A week before that meeting, I'd been living an ordinary life, or at least, something that looked like one from the outside. I worked as an art teacher at the local community center. My apartment was small, second floor, with a balcony overlooking a noisy street and a stubborn plant I kept forgetting to water. Most evenings, I'd make a cup of chamomile tea, grade a few sketch assignments, and scroll through pictures of people I used to know but no longer spoke to. Family was a complicated word for me. My father, Charles Turner, was a man of rules and pride, a retired accountant who believed loyalty meant choosing sides, not keeping peace. He and Aunt Margaret had once been inseparable. Until money, and one old piece of land, turned them into enemies. The farmhouse had belonged to their parents. After Grandma's death, Margaret stayed to care for the property, while my father moved to the city. He claimed she'd stolen it from him, she claimed he'd abandoned it. And me? I was 13 when it all blew up, too young to understand, old enough to remember every bitter word. I still recall the day my father forbade me from visiting her. "She's not family anymore," he'd said, voice trembling with something between anger and hurt. "You stay away from that house." And I had, until the day I learned it was mine. The call that started everything. The letter from the lawyer had arrived on a Wednesday. Plain envelope, neat handwriting, nothing that suggested my life was about to tilt. I'd opened it between 2 art classes, expecting it to be some tax notice or a charity pamphlet. Notice of estate proceedings, Margaret Wells. The moment I saw her name, I froze. I'd heard she passed, news travels quickly in small towns, but I hadn't gone to the funeral. My father said it would reopen wounds. I listened to him, as I always did. But now, here I was being summoned. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept circling the same thought, why me? I tried to convince myself it was probably nothing. Maybe she'd left me an old painting, a ring, something symbolic. I had no idea what she had set in motion. Back in that office, Daniel was still pacing, muttering under his breath. His wife, Julia, sat with her arms crossed, whispering something I couldn't catch. My father leaned toward me, whispering, "Don't get involved in this, Claire. We'll sort it out legally. Just, don't go to that house." That house. The image of it flashed in my mind: white shutters, ivy climbing the brick walls, the porch swing that creaked in summer wind. I hadn't seen it in over a decade. And yet, part of me wanted to go. To understand what she wanted from me. When the meeting ended, I stepped out into the cold air. The winter light was thin, fading fast, and I stood by my car for a long moment, gripping the keys in my hand. Daniel brushed past me on his way out, his eyes burning. "You think this is some kind of gift?" he hissed. "You have no idea what she's done." Before I could ask what he meant, he was gone. And I was left with nothing but a key, old, rusted, heavy, and a letter with my name written in Aunt Margaret's delicate cursive. I didn't open it right away. But I knew, as I sat in my car watching the snow begin to fall, that whatever was written inside would change everything I thought I knew about our family. I didn't go right away. For 3 days, that envelope sat on my kitchen counter, unopened, accusing, like it was watching me every time I walked by. I'd pick it up, trace my fingers over her handwriting, then set it back down again. The 4th morning, I gave in. I made myself a cup of coffee, sat by the window, and finally slit the top open with a kitchen knife. Inside was a single folded letter, cream paper, faint smell of lavender. "My dear Claire," it began. "If you're reading this, I am gone, but that doesn't mean I stopped thinking of you. I've left you the farmhouse not as a burden, but as a truth. There are things you need to see, and things I couldn't say aloud. Go there. Stay for a few days. You'll understand why I chose you." No explanation. No apology. No hint of what I was supposed to understand. Still, I knew one thing for certain: I couldn't ignore her anymore. The drive back. The farmhouse was a 3-hour drive from the city, long enough for doubts to grow legs. I left early Saturday morning, the winter sky still pale and heavy. My father hadn't called since the will reading, and I hadn't called him either. It felt like there was too much unsaid between us, like words might only make it worse. I packed light: a few clothes, my sketchbook, a small camera, and the letter. As the city thinned into quiet countryside, my chest grew tighter. The trees along the highway gave way to open fields, patches of snow glowing softly under the rising sun. I remembered summers out there, when Aunt Margaret's laughter filled the air and everything smelled like wildflowers and bread. She used to make honey biscuits that stuck to your fingers, always served with milk she claimed tasted happier because it came from her own cow. Then came the fight. The shouting. The day my father slammed the car door and drove us away. I could still hear her voice calling after us, her words half lost in the wind. "Don't let him make you hate me too, Claire." For years, I tried not to remember. But as I turned onto the familiar dirt road, memory didn't ask for permission. It just came rushing back. The house that waited. The farmhouse looked almost the same. White paint peeling, roof sagging a little near the edge, a porch swing hanging crooked on one chain. But the moment I stepped out of the car, something in me stirred, the faintest warmth of nostalgia. It wasn't empty. There were footprints in the thin dusting of snow leading to the back door. Fresh ones. I hesitated. Maybe Daniel had come by? Maybe someone was squatting? Still, I walked up the steps, key in hand. The wood groaned beneath my weight. When I pushed the door open, the smell hit me: old wood, lavender oil, and faint traces of burnt sugar. She'd always loved to bake when she was nervous. Inside, the house was tidy, almost lovingly preserved. There were flowers on the table, wilted but recent. A mug still sat by the sink. Someone had been here not long ago. I ran my fingers along the old dining table, the same one where she'd once braided my hair while I told her stories from school. On the wall hung a family portrait: my father, Aunt Margaret, and their parents. It had been taken before the feud. Before pride took root where love once grew. Her bedroom was upstairs. I hesitated on the staircase, every creak echoing like a heartbeat. In her room, sunlight filtered through lace curtains. The bed was made, a shawl folded neatly at the end. On the dresser sat a small wooden box with my name carved into the lid. Inside were photographs. Some I remembered, me as a child, grinning with missing teeth. My mother, smiling in the garden before she passed. Aunt Margaret holding me on her lap, the world still whole. But there was one photo I didn't recognize. It was of a woman, much younger, standing beside a man I didn't know, in front of this very house. The woman looked like my aunt, but not quite. Her features were softer, her hair shorter. The back of the photo read, Eleanor and James, 1975. Eleanor. That wasn't a name I knew. I slipped the photo back into the box, uneasy. Maybe it was an old friend. Maybe nothing at all. But something about the way it was hidden, beneath the other pictures, made me feel like I'd stumbled on something I wasn't supposed to. The town's whisper. Later that afternoon, I went into town to buy groceries and cleaning supplies. It felt strange walking through streets I hadn't seen since childhood, the same bakery, the same tiny post office, even the same old bell above the door of Miller's General Store. But when the clerk, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, heard my name, her expression changed. Turner, she said softly. You're Margaret's niece, aren't you? I nodded. She used to talk about you. Said you were the only one who understood her. That startled me. I hadn't seen her in years, I said. The woman sighed. She didn't see many people near the end. Kept to herself mostly. But she always said you'd come back one day. Her words lingered with me all the way back to the car. That night, I made soup on her old stove. The pipes rattled when I turned on the tap, and the kettle whistled with a pitch that sounded almost human. I sat by the kitchen window with my bowl, staring at the empty fields, wondering what truth she'd wanted me to find. The moonlight hit the edges of the wooden box on the counter. Inside, that photograph waited, the young woman named Eleanor staring out from another lifetime. I decided I'd ask someone about her in the morning. But just as I turned off the light, I heard something, a faint sound coming from the porch. A slow, deliberate knock. 3 times. Then silence. When I opened the door, no one was there, only the wind, and a single folded note wedged between the floorboards. It read, You shouldn't have come back. I didn't sleep much that night. The note sat on the kitchen table, the ink smudged slightly from the damp air. You shouldn't have come back. I read it again and again, trying to convince myself it was a prank, maybe kids messing around. But there was something about the handwriting, small, deliberate, almost elegant. It didn't feel like a child's hand. I double-checked the locks. Every door, every window. Then I sat up on the couch with the lights on, my heart refusing to settle. Outside, the wind dragged across the fields, carrying faint echoes that could have been anything, the creak of old wood, the whine of distant metal, or maybe just the house remembering. By dawn, I decided I needed answers. Traces of a life. After breakfast, I started cleaning, more to keep busy than out of purpose. Dusting, wiping, opening drawers I hadn't seen since childhood. The house felt alive, somehow, as if it had been waiting for me to start asking questions. In the study, I found stacks of papers tied with string, letters from years ago, some addressed to my father, all returned unopened. She'd written to him dozens of times. Every one stamped return to sender. The sight of them made my chest ache. She'd reached out, and he'd pushed her away. On her desk sat a half-finished journal, the last entry dated a few months before she died. He still blames me. Even after all these years. I thought time might soften him, but it's only sharpened his hurt. Maybe Claire will see through what he never did. I traced the ink with my fingertip. See through what he never did. What was she trying to show me? Beneath the journal was an envelope, sealed, unaddressed. The same lavender scent. Inside were several old photographs. Most were of the farmhouse, the garden, the well, the attic window glowing at dusk. But one stood out. It was my father and Aunt Margaret, standing in front of the house as children, maybe 10 and 12. Between them was a baby in a cradle. On the back, written in the same careful cursive, were the words, "For Eleanor." My stomach turned. That name again. Eleanor. The woman in the earlier photo. The name my aunt whispered through her will and letters like a secret buried under generations of silence. But who was she? An unexpected visitor. Around noon, I heard the crunch of tires on the gravel driveway. I froze. When I looked out the window, a silver car had pulled up. The man who stepped out was familiar, broad-shouldered, dark coat, eyes like my father's but colder. Daniel. I met him on the porch, keeping the door half closed. "You shouldn't be here," he said flatly. I crossed my arms. I could say the same. He sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Look, Claire, this whole thing with the will, it's a mess. Mom wasn't in her right mind. She was confused." "She seemed pretty clear," I said quietly. His jaw tightened. "You don't understand what she did to this family." "What she did to me?" I frowned. "What are you talking about?" He hesitated, then looked past me, into the house. His voice softened. "She loved you like a daughter, you know. More than she ever loved me." The words stung. Not because they were cruel, but because of the pain beneath them. "Daniel," I began, but he cut me off. "You should sell this place. Don't dig into her mess. You'll regret it." And before I could ask another word, he turned and walked back to his car. I watched him drive off until the dust settled and silence crept back in. Echoes in the walls. That evening, I explored the house again, this time, with a purpose. The attic stairs were narrow, the air thick with dust and something faintly sweet, like dried apples. I pulled the cord for the hanging bulb. The light flickered weakly, revealing boxes stacked to the ceiling. Most were labeled neatly, holiday decorations, old receipts, kitchenware. But in the far corner, under a faded quilt, was a trunk marked Eleanor. I crouched down, heart pounding, and lifted the lid. Inside were letters tied with blue ribbon, a few articles of baby clothing, and a small silver locket. When I opened it, inside was a photograph, a baby's face, blurry with age. Underneath was a birth certificate. The name hit me like a punch. Eleanor Margaret Turner, born 1975. Parents, Charles Turner and Margaret Wells. My breath caught. My father and aunt. It couldn't be right. I stared at it, reading it again and again, hoping I'd misunderstood. But the words didn't change. They'd had a child together. No, it didn't make sense. It couldn't. Then I noticed the date, 1975. The same year my mother had miscarried, according to what my father always told me. But what if that wasn't the full story? I sank down onto the floor, the paper trembling in my hands. The call home. I didn't want to believe it. That night, I called my father. He answered on the second ring, his voice rough. "Claire? Are you still out there?" "Yes," I said softly. "I found something." Silence. "Dad, who's Eleanor?" The line went quiet, too quiet. Then came a long exhale, like he'd been holding his breath for years. "Where did you hear that name?" "In the house. There's a trunk with her things. There's a birth certificate. Throw it away." His voice cracked like thunder. "Dad, what is going on? Was she—" "Don't ask questions you don't want answered, Claire," he snapped. "That woman poisoned this family. And if you're smart, you'll walk away before she poisons you too." The call ended before I could speak. I sat there, staring at my phone, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. If Aunt Margaret was the villain he claimed she was, Then why did everything she left behind feel like a plea for understanding, not revenge? Somewhere deep down, I knew I wasn't going anywhere. Because I needed to know who Eleanor really was, and what my family had done to her. I couldn't sleep after that call. My father's voice, the sharp edge of fear in it, kept echoing in my head. Throw it away. It wasn't anger I'd heard in him, it was terror. By morning, I knew I couldn't leave the mystery buried. Whatever Eleanor's story was, it was the reason Aunt Margaret had reached out to me, and maybe the reason my father couldn't forgive her. So I went back up to the attic. The trunk's secrets. The light bulb flickered weakly again as I lifted the rest of the contents from the trunk. Beneath the baby clothes and papers was a small stack of envelopes, all addressed to Charles Turner. None were opened. I untied the ribbon. The first letter began simply. Charles. I never meant for things to happen this way. You were my brother before you were anything else, and I thought time might make you see that. Her brother. Then another line stopped me cold. I kept your secret for as long as I could. But she deserves the truth, even if it breaks us. The next letter's ink had bled from tears, or rain, or both. Eleanor is gone, Charles. She was barely 20 when she left. She said she couldn't stay in a family built on lies. I sank to the floor, shaking. Eleanor wasn't their child. She was someone between them. I read on, my eyes scanning for sense. Piece by piece, the truth began to take shape. My father and Aunt Margaret had both loved the same woman. The hidden affair. The more I read, the more I understood the impossible tangle of my family's history. Eleanor was my father's fiancée in the 1970s, a bright, kind woman who came to live on the farm while they planned their wedding. Aunt Margaret had been 17 then, shy and lonely after their parents died. But loneliness can twist into something else when love feels scarce. Margaret and Eleanor had become inseparable, baking together, painting, walking by the fields. Until one night, something changed between them. I could barely breathe as I read. You called me a thief, Charles. But you can't steal what was never yours. She chose me. She wanted a life that didn't belong to your rules or expectations. And you punished her for it. I dropped the letter, my hands trembling. Eleanor had left him for Margaret. And the scandal, in a small, conservative town in 1975, must have destroyed them both. That was the betrayal. Not money, not property. Love. And my father, humiliated, had rewritten the story for decades. The missing years. But there was more. The last envelope was thicker than the rest, and inside it, a final letter written much later. Claire will need to know someday. I wasn't ashamed of loving her. But I was ashamed of what came after. Eleanor and I left town for a while. We had a daughter. We named her Grace. But Eleanor couldn't bear the weight of exile. She left when Grace was 2, and I raised her alone until the sickness came. The words blurred. Grace. I flipped through the documents again, my pulse racing. Another birth certificate slipped loose, Grace Wells, born 1977. Mother, Eleanor Margaret Turner. Eleanor was not my father's child. She was his lover. And Grace, her daughter, was Aunt Margaret's. Which meant Grace was my cousin. But that also meant Aunt Margaret had hidden an entire life, a family, from the world. The betrayal revisited. The room felt suddenly small, the air thick. I stumbled downstairs, clutching the letters, and sat at the kitchen table, the wood cool beneath my hands. I tried to imagine it, my father finding out his sister had run away with the woman he loved. The public shame, the gossip, the fury that must have followed. And then Margaret, living with that secret all her life, raising a child in silence while the rest of the family pretended neither of them existed. The feud had never been about the farmhouse. It had been about what happened inside it. The place wasn't cursed by greed, it was haunted by love that couldn't be spoken. The confrontation. I needed to hear it from him. I called my father again. This time, he didn't answer. So I drove home. The city was gray that day, the streets slick with rain. His apartment smelled faintly of coffee and mothballs, the same way it always did. When he opened the door and saw me, his face went pale. "You read them," he said quietly. I nodded. "You lied to me. All my life." He turned away, bracing himself against the counter. "You weren't supposed to find those." "She loved Eleanor," I said. "And you couldn't forgive her for it." He laughed bitterly. "Forgive her? She took everything from me, my fiancé, my reputation, my family name. Do you know what it was like back then? People spat at us in church. They called her sick." His voice cracked. "I didn't hate her for loving a woman. I hated her for choosing her over me." I stood there, speechless. For the first time, I saw my father not as a monster or a martyr, but as a man who'd been broken and never learned how to heal. "She didn't leave you out of cruelty," I said softly. "She left you because you wouldn't see her truth." He turned, eyes wet. "And what good did that truth do her? She died alone, Claire. And now she's dragged you into it too." He sank into his chair, shoulders heavy. "I spent my life trying to bury her story. I thought if I erased it, maybe I could forget. I wanted to be angry. But all I felt was sadness, for both of them." Margaret's final message. When I returned to the farmhouse that night, the wind had died down. The air was still, almost peaceful. I sat by the fire and opened one last envelope I hadn't noticed before, tucked at the back of the trunk, addressed simply, "To Claire, when you're ready. If you found this, then you've uncovered the truth. I never wanted you to choose between us. I wanted you to see that love, in any form, is never the sin people make it out to be. Your father and I both paid a price for being human. But maybe you won't have to. The house is yours now because it holds our story, all of it, ugly and beautiful. Keep it safe. And forgive him if you can. He lost more than he'll ever admit." Tears blurred the page. I closed my eyes and let the crackle of the fire fill the silence. For the first time I understood why she'd chosen me, not to give me property, but to give me truth. The legacy wasn't money. It was the courage to see people fully, even when they'd hurt each other beyond repair. And somewhere in that, maybe forgiveness could begin. The next morning, I woke to the sound of rain on the old farmhouse windows. The world outside was quiet, the kind of quiet that follows a storm, when even the trees seem to hold their breath. The trunk was still open on the floor, letters scattered like ghosts that had finally spoken. I'd found the truth. But now I had to decide what to do with it. The auction. 2 days later, I got a letter from the lawyer handling Aunt Margaret's estate. The town council wanted to purchase the farmhouse, to repurpose it into a heritage site. My father had already agreed to sell his half of the adjoining land. All I had to do was sign. The thought of it, of bulldozers, of plaques with half-true histories, made my stomach turn. This place held generations of secrets, grief, and love. It deserved more than a curated lie. So I drove into town to speak with the lawyer myself. The courthouse smelled of dust and varnish. The lawyer, a polite man with silver-rimmed glasses, looked surprised when I walked in. "Miss Turner. I assumed you'd signed the release." "I'm not selling," I said. "Not yet." He blinked. "Your father's already made his statement. It could complicate things." I smiled faintly. "It usually does." Grace. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the name in Aunt Margaret's final letter, Grace Wells. If she was still alive, if she existed at all, she was my cousin. And maybe, the last living piece of Aunt Margaret's truth. So I started searching. Old records, online archives, birth notices. It took days, but finally a small article popped up, local art teacher, Grace Wells, opens exhibit on rural family life. The photo showed a woman in her late 40s, with calm eyes and a streak of silver through her dark hair. She looked familiar in a way that made my heart ache. The next day, I drove 3 hours to the address listed at the bottom of the article. The meeting. Grace's studio was a converted barn at the edge of a quiet town. Canvases lined the walls, paintings of farmhouses, wheat fields, women sitting at kitchen tables with unread letters beside them. When she turned and saw me, something flickered in her expression. "Can I help you?" I hesitated. "You don't know me, but I think we're family." Her eyes narrowed, cautious. "Family?" I told her everything, about Aunt Margaret's will, the trunk, the letters. About Eleanor. About the truth I had pieced together. When I finished, she didn't speak for a long time. Then she sat down, eyes glistening. "I always wondered if someone would come," she said softly. "My mother told me pieces of it before she died. Said she'd loved a woman once, and that it ruined her life. I never knew her name." She looked at me, really looked. "So, you're Charles's daughter?" I nodded. "And you're Margaret's." We sat in silence, the air between us heavy with generations of silence that finally had words. Then Grace smiled faintly. "They'd probably both hate this, us sitting here, talking." I laughed through tears. "Yeah. Probably." The truth set free. Grace drove back with me to the farmhouse that weekend. When she stepped inside, her breath caught. "It smells the same," she whispered. "Pine and cinnamon." She used to bake when she was nervous. We spent hours in the attic, sorting through the trunk, her hands trembling as she touched the letters her mother had written decades ago. Somewhere between dusk and dawn, she found a photograph folded into one of the envelopes, Aunt Margaret and Eleanor standing in a field of wildflowers, sunlight in their hair, holding hands. For the first time I saw them not as a scandal, or a secret, or a tragedy, but as two women who had tried, however briefly, to live freely in a world that wasn't ready for them. Grace traced their faces with her thumb. "They deserved better," she said. "They did," I whispered. "And maybe now they'll get it." The decision. A week later, I called the lawyer. "I'm not selling the farmhouse," I told him. "I'm turning it into a small retreat, for artists, for women, for anyone who needs a quiet place to breathe." He hesitated. "That's unorthodox." "Maybe," I said. But so was she. Grace agreed to help. She'd curate the space with her artwork, filling it with paintings inspired by the women who lived there before us. And for the first time, the farmhouse wouldn't be a secret. It would be a story, one we chose to tell openly. The final goodbye. Before the renovation began, I invited my father to visit. He arrived looking older than I remembered, the weight of the past heavy in his eyes. When he stepped into the kitchen, he froze. The letters were gone now, sealed in a memory box on the mantel. I poured him tea. "I met Grace," I said quietly. He didn't look surprised. "Just tired." "She looks like her mother, doesn't she?" "She does," I said. "And she doesn't hate you." He stared into his cup. I hated myself long before I hated them. For a moment, I thought he might cry. Instead, he stood and walked to the window, staring out at the overgrown fields. "It's still beautiful here," he said softly. "Even after everything." I nodded. "That's the point." He turned back to me. "What will you do with it now?" "I'll tell their story," I said. "Properly. Maybe that's how healing starts." He gave a small, broken smile. "Then maybe I can rest easier." Epilogue. Months later, as the farmhouse reopened, sunlight spilled through the restored windows, lighting up Grace's paintings on the walls, women laughing, crying, holding hands through time. Visitors came, drawn by curiosity. They left in tears. I watched them from the doorway, a quiet sense of peace settling in my chest. Aunt Margaret's words echoed in my mind. "The house is yours now because it holds our story, all of it, ugly and beautiful." And for the first time I understood that sometimes, inheritance isn't about what we keep. It's about what we finally set free. It's been almost a year since the farmhouse opened its doors again. The smell of fresh paint has long faded, replaced by lavender and the faint sweetness of old wood warmed by sunlight. Every few weeks, Grace drives up from the city, and we spend the weekends tending to the garden Aunt Margaret once loved: hydrangeas, daisies, a few stubborn roses that keep blooming no matter how harsh the season. Sometimes, when the evening light falls just right, I swear I can see her shadow at the kitchen window. Not haunting, just watching. Proud. Letters and visitors. People come from everywhere. Writers. Painters. Women in their 60s carrying journals. Young couples trying to find their footing. They leave letters in the guest book, stories of betrayal, forgiveness, and courage. One woman wrote, "I came here angry at my sister. I'm leaving ready to call her again." Another wrote, "This house holds grief like a soft cloth, gently, without judgment." Every note feels like another small piece of healing stitched into the walls. I never thought I'd run a place like this. I was a graphic designer once, practical, organized, afraid of messes that couldn't be cleaned up with logic. But this house taught me that some messes aren't meant to be cleaned. They're meant to be understood. My father. My father visits sometimes. Not often, but enough. He brings his own quiet guilt, wrapped in old age and trembling hands. He never says the words "I'm sorry," but I don't need him to anymore. Last spring, he brought an old wooden frame. Inside was a black and white photo of Aunt Margaret as a child, sitting on a porch step, hair in ribbons, a book balanced on her knees. "She used to read to me," he said, "when I was scared of thunder." I looked at him and saw not the angry man who'd cut her out, but the little boy who once hid under blankets while his big sister whispered stories to calm him down. Time changes everything, especially the way we remember the people who hurt us. Grace's gift. When the first anniversary of the retreat came, Grace unveiled a new painting. It was titled Inheritance. The canvas showed the farmhouse under twilight, windows glowing, door open, wildflowers swaying in the breeze. In the sky above, faint outlines of two women stood hand in hand, fading into the light. Beneath the frame, she wrote a small note. For those who loved quietly. And those who finally dared to speak. I couldn't hold back the tears. Because that was Aunt Margaret's story, and mine. The letter I wrote but never sent. A few weeks later, I sat at the old oak desk, the same one from the attic, and wrote a letter I never intended to send. Dear Aunt Margaret. I found your truth. And I understand now, why you left, why you loved, why you stayed silent. You weren't running from us. You were running toward yourself. I wish I could have known you. I think we would have been friends. Your house is full again. Laughter, footsteps, voices. Grace and I sit on your porch some evenings and imagine you there, apron dusted with flour, scolding us for tracking mud through your clean kitchen. You left us more than land. You left us courage. And I promise you, I won't let your story fade again. I folded the letter and placed it under the vase of daisies on the mantel. That night, I slept without dreams. For the first time in years, my heart felt still. The lesson. People often ask why I kept the farmhouse, why I didn't just sell it and move on. I tell them the truth. Because some legacies aren't meant to be spent or inherited. They're meant to be understood. Aunt Margaret's story broke our family, but in breaking it, she also gave us the chance to rebuild it with honesty. And maybe that's what every family secret hides at its core, not shame, but a desperate kind of love. A love that's been waiting, quietly, for someone brave enough to tell the truth. Sometimes, I still drive out to the edge of the property at sunset. The air smells of cedar and rain. The farmhouse glows behind me, windows lit like lanterns in the dusk. And I think about how strange it is, that love and truth can both destroy and save us in the same breath. Aunt Margaret lived a life the world wasn't ready for. My father lived one he couldn't forgive. And I was left standing between them, trying to make sense of the ruins. But somewhere in the middle of all that pain, I found something I never expected. Freedom. Not the kind you shout about. The quiet kind. The kind that sits inside you when you finally stop hiding from your own story. When visitors leave the farmhouse now, I always tell them the same thing. You don't have to forgive to move on. But you do have to understand. Because that's what legacy really is, not the money, not the land, not the things people fight over after you're gone. It's the truth you leave behind. The courage someone else might find in it. If I close my eyes, I can still hear Aunt Margaret's voice, low and steady, the way I imagined she might have sounded. Tell the truth, even if your voice shakes. And maybe that's what this house, this story, was always meant to do. To remind us that silence may protect us for a while, but it never sets us free. What about you? If you uncovered a secret that changed everything you believed about your family, would you tell it? Or would you bury it again, to keep the peace? Tell me what you do, in the comments below. And thank you, for listening.